Well, welcome to the Coach's Corner. Hi, I'm Frank Barbahan, and I will be your discipleship coach for this week. We're into the series on suffering and trauma and forging our new identity in Christ by strategically using suffering and trauma. This is week 4, and we're going to be asking the question, what is suffering and trauma? What is it? Basically, suffering is pain. It can be physical pain, like a friend of mine who was in the Marines and he fell out of a chopper onto the carrier below and broke his back, and is in intense chronic pain and loaded up with narcotics in order to deal with it. And when we go over for dinner, he always has a smile on his face, but it's a smile that pushes through the narcotics. Suffering as pain can be intense emotional pain, which is what I deal with a great deal. Emotional pain that comes from family dysfunction. It comes from difficulties in relationship. It can come from intense experiences like rape. Suffering is pain in the form of losses. So I have a dear friend who is dying right now with brain cancer, and is very painful to be losing my close friend. All right, now what's the difference between suffering and trauma? Trauma is simply very intense suffering. It's very intense pain. Typically, it's the kind of suffering and the kind of pain that most of us get overwhelmed with because we don't have the skills typically to deal with it. So more extreme situations, like I mentioned with my friend breaking his back, or rape, or trauma from hand-to-hand combat in war, and oftentimes extreme family dysfunction, extreme pathology in the parents when a child is very young can traumatize the child. I chronicle in my own book, Faith of a Father, how I was traumatized from infancy. I didn't simply suffer, but I was traumatized, meaning that the suffering that occurred to me, I didn't have any skills to deal with. Certainly didn't have them as an infant, and I didn't have them as a child growing up. So suffering and trauma are on a continuum. What is one person's suffering can be another person's trauma, and what can be somebody's trauma can be another person's suffering. Trauma is basically intense suffering that challenges our skills. Now, what happens with suffering and trauma? Among other things, one key thing that happens is it instigates the fight or flight response. We have a phylogenetically primitive part of the brain that mobilizes everything in us to either fight or to flee. So in Cro-Magnon times, a Cro-Magnon person seeing a bear would have this mobilization in their body where the blood would flow faster, the heart's racing. Adrenaline pours out, the pupils dilate so you can see better, and everything gears up to either fight the bear or to run from the bear, fight or flight. But now in a cultured society and with suffering, and the fight or flight response is mobilized, how in the world do we fight and how in the world do we flee? Typically with suffering, we can't flee it, although some try with drugs and alcohol or gambling. And how do we fight it? We try to fight it with modern medicine, but we can't fight like with a spear. So suffering and trauma that sits in our craw mobilizes this fight or flight. And unless that suffering or trauma is in some way or other dealt with, and unless it's somehow or other healed, that fight or flight response just keeps playing over and over again. So suffering or trauma mobilizes fight or flight. And unless you deal with the suffering and trauma, it doesn't settle down. And fight or flight, when you keep it going, just keep it going, It creates depression and anxiety and the various disorders surrounding anxiety and depression. All right, your thoughts or questions, feel free to blog me at the Coach's Corner or email me at frank@peakperformancediscipleship.com, frank@peakperformancediscipleship.com, and we'll see you next week.